Welcome to Attic Raiders Retro Reviews, where today I'm going to be painting up the Murmillo Gladiator from the Wargames Atlantic's Blood on the Sand freebie frame, which comes with the June issue of Wargames Illustrated. To see my full review and build of that frame, you can check out the video linked above. So, let's get on to painting. When I'm painting, I like to start with a colour that has the largest surface area. So sometimes that's clothing, but in the case of these gladiators, that's the skin, because there is a lot of exposed skin on these guys. So here I'm using a very old Citadel dwarf flesh, which sadly is out of production, and I've mixed that with some wraith bone in order to get a very light colour tone. Once that's on, I want to go over it and to get some more definition and shading, and for that I'm using Bugman's Glow, which has been watered down a lot. And that means it's going to pull in those deeper areas and flow off of the raised areas. Once that's dry, I'm then going to go back and tidy it up a bit with a dry brush of that base colour. And you can see I'm using a really old scabby brush for this. And that's just going to pick up those raised highlights and make them pop more. I then take that dwarf flesh and mix in even more wraith bone to make it a lighter shade, and then use it to carefully, once it's watered down a little bit, to pick out the tops of these muscles, and that's really going to give some nice definition to this guy. With the flesh finished, I'm then going to build up his outfit in layers, starting from the bottom layer. So here I'm using Gorthor Brown from Citadel in order to paint in those leather straps across his chest. It's then on to the next layer, which is closest to his flesh, so these leg wraps I'm picking out in Rakarth flesh. And I'm going to use that on the padding wrapped around his arm as well. For the Murmillo's leg greave or ochria, I'm using Brass Scorpion. I'm also using that on his helmet, his belt and his arm guard or manica. Now, strictly speaking, if I'm going for historical accuracy, then this arm guard probably shouldn't be made of metal. It should probably be segmented sections of leather. I'm in two minds about going back and going over it in shades of brown. What do you think? Should I leave it as metal, or do you think it should be leather? More Gorthor Brown for the leather straps across the back of his legs, and also for the straps holding his arm guard on. Red is a colour that works really well on these gladiator figures, so for this I'm using a really deep, dark colour red. This one is World Bearer's Red from Citadel. And we're now at a point that you've got to be careful not to get these strong colours overlapping or spilling onto the flesh. If you do though, you can quickly wipe them off with just some water on your paintbrush, and it'll come off, if you do it quick enough, with no problem. When it comes to his sword or gladius, I'm using Humbrol 53 metallic gunmetal, but you could use any kind of metal colour for this. I want to continue that red theme with his crest, so for this I'm using Humbrol 73 matte wine colour. I'm then going to pick out the little feathers on either side of his helmet with a nice ivory coloured wraith bone. And with all my base colours applied, it's now time to start adding some definition and volume. So for that, I'm going back over all of the metal pieces with some Agrax Earthshade. And that deep dark brown is going to flow into all of the recesses and really make all the details stand out. It'll also add a brown tone to all of that brass and really make it look darker and more weathered, which is what I want. Once I'm finished with those brass metals, I'm then changing over to a different shade. This time I'm going for some Nuln oil, and I'm applying that over everything that's basically not skin. So all of the wraps, the white feathers on his helmet's crest, where you can see it starts to bring out that detail really nicely, and his red loincloth. Now I could mix up darker shades of each of these colours and paint them carefully into the crevices, but this is a much faster way of doing things and is a lot simpler. And finally, just a little bit onto that sword to darken it down and weather it more. Once all the brass metal has been weathered down and made darker, we then want to make the highlights brighter so that it pops, we get contrast and we get visual interest. So for this, I'm using some Gehenna's Gold and dry brushing it over the top, just picking up all of those raised areas. Now you are quite likely to get this onto the flesh when you're doing this, so make sure you've got a clean paintbrush with some water on it, ready to wipe some of that off of the skin if you smudge over onto it. To pick out the highlights on the crest, I'm dry brushing with a nice bright red. This one is Evil Sun's Scarlet. And again, I'm using that same bright red in order to dry brush across the loincloth, picking up all of those raised areas in the folds. Just be sure to move your brush perpendicular to those fold lines in order for them to pick up the paint properly. Again, you could paint each of those fold lines in by hand with a very thin brush, but this is a much faster way of doing things. Before adding the basing material, I decided to paint the plastic base yellow so that if any showed through the material, then you wouldn't see grey. But as it turned out, this step was completely unnecessary, so if I was doing this again, I just wouldn't bother with this bit. The Murmillo Gladiator is named such after a kind of Greek saltwater fish called the Murmillos, because the Murmillo has got a large kind of crest shaped like a dorsal fin going across the top of its helmet. Which also goes to explain why Wargames Atlantic has produced this shield or scutum with a double fish insignia on it. Now, while I was doing some research on Google Images, I actually found that this is based on a real shield which is used by a Roman gladiator reenactor. So I decided to copy the colours used on the reenactor's shield. I highly recommend checking out Dimitrios's video about the Murmillo, and his whole channel is really fascinating. He's got lots of good information on there. I painted my shield Corvus black, and then I went and dry brushed Talorn sand, this yellow colour, over the top of the raised fish motifs in order to bring them out. You can then go back to the main bodies of the fish and use a finer brush to carefully fill in any colour where it might not have been picked up during that dry brush. And then you can go back with the black and a fine brush in order to neaten up any areas where the yellow's gone onto the black. Then using that Humbrol gunmetal again in order to pick out the metal piece in the centre of the shield, and then giving the edges of the shield a careful known oil wash in order to neaten those up, and adding some more over the metal piece in the centre to give it some more depth and dimension. Now that everything's been painted and the shield's not going to get in the way of the painting process, it can get glued onto his hand. And then there's just a little bit of fiddling so you can get the shield into the best position so that it looks good. For the basing material, I've just collected some sand from my local beach and mixed it with PVA glue, getting it nice and thick so that it covers and hides the step in the base here. It can be a little difficult to work with when it's this thick, but I just use the opposite end of the paintbrush to push it into place, particularly around the feet. Now you can use a thinner consistency by mixing more PVA glue than sand, but I find that that tends to self-level and then that step starts to show through. As the gladiator is supposed to be standing on sand, I'm not going to bother actually painting this and just leave it as is. All I'm going to do is go in and touch up the rim of the base with some Abaddon black. You can see that the consistency here is quite watery because my paint was starting to dry out, so I had to mix it with some water. But if you find that it's too thin, then you just let it dry and do a couple of coats and it will look great. And that is my Murmillo finished. I'm quite happy with him, though looking at him there are some changes that I could potentially make. I am thinking about maybe changing that arm guard to shades of brown for leather instead of metal, and looking at the sand here with all of that sand out on the rotating board, it does look quite particulate and gravelly, so I'm considering going back and painting over the top of the sand to make it look less like beach sand and crushed shells. And also, since the game is called Blood on the Sands, really, do I need to put some blood on the sand? It's something I am considering doing. So what do you think? Sand, blood, arm guard? Would you change any of these things? Let me know in the comments down below. Well, I hope that's been helpful to you. If it has been, please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll be back next time with more wargaming and vintage board games on Attic Raiders Retro Reviews.